The oil lamp in the corner of the room burns low. Its flame is small, steady, barely moving, and the light it throws across the clay floor does not reach the far wall. Two infants lie in a wide bronze shield that has been set on the floor and lined with cloth. The curved rim, holding them like a bowl, holds water, the cold metal warm now from the hours they have slept in it. Outside, the city of Thebes is quiet. The streets are empty. The night has been going for longer than any night ordinarily goes, though no one inside the house is awake to measure it. This is the house of Amphitryon, a Theban general of genuine and traceable heroic ancestry, a man whose grandfather was Perseus, the same Perseus who killed the Gorgon Medusa, who flew on winged sandals above the dark sea and returned with a severed head wrapped in leather. Amphitryon himself has been at war, away from Thebes for some period that the tradition does not precisely specify, fighting the people of Taphos in a campaign of retribution for the murder of his wife's brothers. He has not been home. The house has been tended in his absence. The lamps have been trimmed and refilled. The shield was set on the floor by someone in the household who found it the right size and the right weight for a cradle, and the infants were placed in it, and the night drew on, and drew on further still, while everyone in the house slept in the ordinary way that people sleep when nothing unusual is occurring. Nothing unusual has occurred yet. The lamp burns, the infants breathe. The shield cradle rests on the cool clay floor with a slight tilt that no one has bothered to correct, and the curved bronze holds both small bodies safely. The way things made for one purpose can sometimes serve another just as well. This is still simply a house. The night outside is for the moment simply a night. What had happened before this night, however, was not simple at all, and the tradition holds it with the kind of calm precision that very old stories apply to events that were, in their time, unprecedented. Zeus, the king of the Olympian gods, the wielder of the thunderbolt, the figure who in the Greek tradition sat at the apex of the divine hierarchy and concerned himself with the fates of mortals and gods alike, had come to Thebes. He had not arrived as himself. He had come disguised as Amphitryon, wearing the general's face and carrying the general's manner, and he had entered this house and spoken with this man's wife Alcmene, in a way that Alcmene had no reason to question. She had believed her husband had returned from the war. The tradition does not record what they spoke of, or what the evening was like, or whether there was anything in the disguise that might, if she had been looking for it, have seemed slightly wrong. Apollodorus, writing in the Bibliotheca, the 2nd century BCE mythological compendium that serves as one of the most comprehensive and systematically organized accounts of Greek mythology available, records only the essential fact that Zeus visited Alcmene in her husband's form, and that the night he chose for this visit was extended to 3 times its natural length, 3 nights compressed into one, the darkness outside the house lasting far beyond what any night should last, the hours accumulating quietly in a way that would not have been visible from inside the house, the lamp burning, the darkness continuing, the ordinary sounds of a sleeping city, maintaining their ordinary rhythm, while above the horizon the dawn withheld itself, the sun held back by divine arrangement from wherever the sun goes, when the world is not yet ready for it. The tradition does not explain the mechanism of this extension. It records it as a thing that was done by a god who had the power to do it, for reasons that had to do with what he wanted the night to accomplish. Apollodorus notes the extension of the night without particular commentary, the way the Bibliotheca notes most things, carefully, completely, in the register of someone setting down information that needs to be preserved rather than dramatized. And what needed to be preserved was this, that the conception of the child, who would eventually be named Heracles, required the longest night that had ever been made, as though whatever was being set in motion in that Theban house was too large to fit inside the ordinary span of darkness, and needed more room than nature alone could provide. When Amphitryon himself returned from the war, the actual Amphitryon, the mortal general with mud from the road on his sandals, and the particular tiredness of a man who has been fighting and traveling, he discovered that his wife believed he had already been home. She greeted him with a warmth that was more familiar than the warmth of reunion, and in the resulting confusion, the tradition tells us, Amphitryon sought out the seer, Tiresias, to understand what had happened in his own house. Tiresias was blind. He had been blind for longer than most people in the tradition could remember, and different stories gave different accounts of how the blindness had come to him. Struck by Hera for revealing too much, blinded by Athena for seeing too much, granted prophetic vision as compensation for one kind of sight lost, but in all of them, the loss of his eyes was attached to some encounter with the divine that had fundamentally altered what he could perceive. He was old. He had been given a lifespan that extended across multiple ordinary human generations, so that he appeared in multiple mythological accounts, separated by what should have been centuries, still alive, still in Thebans, still consulted by kings and generals who needed to know what an ordinary person could not see. Amphitryon stood before Tiresias in the lamplight of an interior room. The Bibliotheca does not record the full content of what Tyres said to him, only that the seer explained what had occurred, and that Amphitryon listened without interruption, and when Tyres had finished, accepted the explanation. This is, in its way, a remarkable detail. A man is told by a blind seer that a god visited his home, wearing his face, slept with his wife in his absence, extended the night to do it, and that the child now growing inside her is that god's son, and Amphitryon accepted this. He raised the twins, for Alcmaeon carried two children, one divine and one his own, Iphicles, as his sons in Thebes, in the same house, in the same shield cradle, without distinction. Iphicles was Amphitryon's son, conceived the same night when the general returned from war and found his wife in the confused aftermath of Zeus's visit. Iphicles is the child who screams in the accounts of what comes next. He is the twin who is mortal, fully mortal, who grows into a mortal life alongside a brother whose life is anything but, and who appears in the tradition as the other side of a particular contrast that the myths find worth preserving. What an ordinary life looks like when placed next to one chosen from before birth by a god. The shield cradle on the floor of the Theban house holds both of them equally. The bronze rim curves around both children the same way. The lamp throws the same light over both. For now, and for a few more weeks or months of ordinary life, they are simply infants in a house in Thebes, and nothing has yet arrived to make a distinction between them. What the tradition holds about the circumstances surrounding the birth of Heracles reaches further even than the house in Thebes. It reaches to Mycenae, to the palace of Sthenelus, to the particular and precise moment at which his queen Nisic went into labor, and it reaches to the presence of Hera, queen of the Olympian gods, wife of Zeus, Eurystheus in the Greek tradition, who is most consistently and powerfully associated with the protection of marriage and the order of the household, and who had very particular feelings about the child her husband had just arranged to conceive in a mortal woman's bed. Hera's animosity toward Heracles is one of the most sustained and structurally central features of the mythological tradition surrounding him. It runs from his conception, through his earliest infancy, through his marriage and family, through every one of the 12 labors, through the whole long arc of his mortal life, and it shapes everything. Before the child is born, Hera has already moved against him, not through a monster, not through a curse exactly, but through something more precise and more quietly devastating, a manipulation of timing. Zeus had made a declaration, according to both Apollodorus in the Bibliotheca and Homer in the 19th book of the Iliad. He had announced to the assembled gods that a child of Perseus' bloodline would be born that day and would rule over all those around him. The declaration was made with divine authority, intending to establish a precedent for the exceptional kingship that his intended son would one day hold. What Zeus had not accounted for was that Hera was listening, and that Hera understood what he intended, and that Hera was, in the tradition, very capable of acting faster than Zeus anticipated. Nisippe, wife of Sthenelus of Mycenae, was also pregnant. Her child was also a descendant of Perseus, one generation further removed than Heracles would be, and therefore technically within the terms of Zeus's declaration. Hera accelerated Nisippe's labor. Diodorus Siculus, writing in the Bibliotheca Historica, and Apollodorus both record this, that Hera brought Eurystheus into the world prematurely, before his full term, so that he arrived first. And then Hera delayed the delivery of Alcmene, holding back the birth that Zeus had intended to come first. Alcmene's labor, slowed by divine interference, resolved after Eurystheus had already been placed into his mother's hands across the Argolid. In the palace at Mycenae, the premature infant Eurystheus was handed to Nisippe, small and early, breathing in the particular fragile way of infants born before their time. A name was given, arrangements were made, and the declaration Zeus had pronounced over the assembled gods that a descendant of Perseus, born this day, would hold lordship over those around him, settled itself on the wrong child, locked into place by Hera's precise and deliberate intervention in the timing of two labors happening on opposite sides of the Peloponnese. Zeus, according to Homer's account in the Iliad, was furious. The passage in Book 19 where he speaks of this, acknowledging before the Greek army that he had been deceived, that his own wife had outmaneuvered his declaration, carries a quality that is unusual for a god of his authority. It is the quality of a figure who had believed his own power was sufficient to set the terms, discovering that the terms could be altered from the inside. Hera did not override Zeus's declaration. She satisfied the exact conditions he had stated and produced a different result. A descendant of Perseus, born on the appointed day, receiving the lordship Zeus had promised, only not the descendant Zeus had in mind. Eurystheus would sit on the throne of Mycenae. Heracles would, in the fullness of time, be sent to serve him. The tradition holds this arrangement, with a kind of calm interest in the irony of it, that the man who would become the greatest hero in the Greek mythological tradition, who would accomplish things that no mortal had accomplished before, or would accomplish after, spent 12 years formally in the service of a lesser man who held power through a manipulation of divine timing, rather than through any quality of his own. But all of that is still far away from the oil lamp and the shield cradle and the two infants breathing in the Theban house. The moment in the tradition that establishes what Heracles is, before any labor is assigned, before any divine conflict is engaged, before any of the extraordinary accumulation of his adult life has begun, is the moment involving the serpents. The serpents arrive when Heracles is somewhere between 8 and 10 months old, according to the accounts, old enough to have developed the physical capability for what follows, young enough that the event remains astonishing in whatever terms it is examined. 2 serpents came into the room where the twins slept. The tradition is consistent across its sources on the fact that Hera sent them. Pindar, the lyric poet of the 5th century BCE, whose Nemean odes include an account of this episode, gives the scene with the compressed intensity of choral lyric. The serpents moving through the dark toward the shield on the floor, enormous, coiled, the particular kind of enormous that signals divine origin rather than merely natural scale. Theocritus, the Hellenistic poet of the 3rd century BCE, gives a longer and more domestic account in his Idyll 24, setting the event in the context of an ordinary household night that tilts in the middle of it entirely out of the ordinary. Iphicles woke. In the tradition, consistently and without variation across its sources, Iphicles screamed and drew himself away from the thing in the cradle with him, the natural, entirely comprehensible response of an infant encountering something large and dangerous in the dark. He screamed, he recoiled. He was, in this moment, doing exactly what an infant should do, and what any person who had not been shaped by divine parentage and a 3 times extended night of conception would do in identical circumstances. Heracles reached out, both hands, small hands, and infant's hands, grasping each serpent by the body in the darkness, the way an infant grasps anything placed within reach, the grip instinctive and complete, and then the grip tightened. In both Pindar's account and in Theocritus's longer domestic telling, the struggle was brief. This is the detail that the tradition finds worth preserving even more than the strangeness of an infant fighting serpents, that it was brief, that it was over, the serpents hanging still in each small fist with arms extended straight outward, before Alcmene or Amphitryon or anyone in the household could reach the room. When they arrived, drawn by Iphicles' cry, carrying lamps, Alcmene, in the account by Theocritus, described as barefoot and terrified, the household gathering behind her in the narrow doorway, what they found was not an ongoing struggle. What they found was the infant Heracles holding 2 dead serpents in the lamplight, one in each hand, the fight already finished, the room otherwise undisturbed. Iphicles was still crying at the far edge of the cradle. The shield cradle was still on the floor. The oil lamp, if it had not been knocked over in the servants' rush to the room, was still burning somewhere. The tradition, as Theocritus gives it, describes Alcmene taking the serpents from Heracles, extracting them from the infant's grip, which required some effort because the grip did not relax willingly, while Amphitryon reached for his sword before understanding that the danger was already past. And Heracles, according to Theocritus, laughed. This is the detail that the Idyll 24 specifically includes. The infant laughed, delighted, having found what he found and done what he did, and now looking at the adults who had rushed into the room with the particular unconcerned interest of a very young child who has not yet learned to understand what expressions of alarm on adult faces are meant to convey. Pindar's version in the Nemean Odes does not include the laugh. Pindar's version is more compressed, more formal, the event held in the elevated register of choral lyric, where specific domestic detail is less present and the scale of what has just occurred takes up the full space of the telling. What Pindar conveys is the structural significance of the moment, that this was not an ordinary infant demonstrating unusual strength, but a divine child establishing, in the first months of a mortal life, what the terms of that life would be. Something extraordinary had arrived in the world. The serpents in the shield cradle were, in this reading of the tradition, Hera's test and Hera's message simultaneously. A test because she needed to know what she was dealing with, and a message because she intended to remind the household and whoever was watching from Olympus exactly what she thought of Zeus's other arrangements. The message, if it was intended to discourage, produced the opposite effect. Amphitryon, Theocritus tells us, summoned Tiresias the following morning. The blind seer, still in Thebes, still consulted by those who needed to know things an ordinary person could not see, came to the house and gave an account of what he had perceived about the child's future, a long account, according to Theocritus, moving through a sequence of labors and monsters and events that the poet gestures toward without fully detailing, each one following the last in the order the seer could see and the parents could not. Tiresias was not alarmed by what he described. He was informative. The boy grew up in Thebes under the name Alcides. This was the name that belonged to his mortal lineage, the name that marked him as a descendant of Alcaeus, the father of Amphitryon, the name that situated him within a specific family with a specific history in a specific city. He was taught, as the tradition records it across several sources, by a range of teachers appropriate to a young man of heroic lineage. He learned to drive a chariot. He learned to wrestle. He learned to play the lyre. Though the tradition includes an account of an incident involving a lyre and his music teacher Linus that ended badly for Linus, and which established fairly early that the ordinary rules governing appropriate responses to criticism applied to Heracles in ways that required some adjustment. He learned archery from Eurytus, whom some sources name as one of the best archers in the mythological tradition. He grew. Alcmene and Amphitryon watched a boy grow up in their house who was not entirely like other boys, in ways that the tradition holds at a slight distance, recording the teachers and the training without dwelling on the specific quality of what made the difference visible. He was strong in a way that exceeded the explanations available for it. He was capable in a way that outpaced what the training could account for. He was also in the tradition that surrounds his young life in Thebes, before any divine business interrupts it, simply present, a young man in a city, growing up in a family that included a mortal twin and a mortal stepfather who had accepted, that night in the room with Tiresias, the full implications of what had arrived in his household. The name Alcaeus would not stay with him. This is a thing that the mythological tradition returns to, the moment at Delphi when the name was changed, when the boy from Thebes who had grown into whatever he had grown into arrived at the sanctuary of Apollo on the slopes of Mount Parnassus and left with a different name. The oracle at Delphi was the institution through which Apollo spoke to mortals in the Greek tradition, not directly, but through the Pythia, the high priestess who sat on a bronze tripod above a narrow opening in the rock in the inner sanctum of the temple, and who entered a state that ancient visitors consistently described as unlike ordinary perception, and who spoke in a register that required interpretation. The renaming happened there. The name she gave him, the name that the tradition settled on and kept, is a compound of two Greek elements: Hera, the goddess, Kleos, glory. Together they make Heracles, which Diodorus Siculus in the Bibliotheca Historica, writing in the 1st century BCE, noted with the particular deliberate attention of a writer who understood that he was identifying something genuinely strange. The name means, in its straightforward Greek compound, glory of Hera, the goddess whose name the hero carries through the entire mythological tradition, the goddess whose hostility shapes every major event of his life, who manipulated the timing of his birth, who sent the serpents into the cradle, who would go on to drive him to the destruction of his family, and then designed 12 years of penitential labor to follow. That goddess's name is embedded in the name of the hero as his defining possession, his kleos, his glory. Diodorus observes the irony plainly. The goddess who persecuted him most relentlessly became, through that very persecution, the source of his immortal fame. Every labor she arranged through Eurystheus, every monster she raised against him, Every difficulty she placed in the path of his mortal life contributed to the accumulation of a fame that Greek culture would carry forward for centuries, that would be carved into marble metopes above temple doorways and sung in choral odes at Panhellenic festivals, and written into mythological compendiums that would survive long enough to reach hands entirely different from the ones that first held them. The name she did not give him, the name given to him at Delphi by Apollo's oracle, in the formal context of a religious renaming that marked a transition from one version of a life to another, carries her in it anyway. The tradition finds this worth sitting with. Not as a paradox exactly, and not as a lesson about the unintended consequences of divine malice, but as one of those features of the mythological world that resists being fully resolved into a neat meaning and is more interesting for that resistance. Hera hated Heracles. The name Heracles means the glory of Hera. Both of these things are true simultaneously in the tradition, and neither one cancels the other out, and the compound syllables of the name carry both the hatred and the glory in the same four sounds. He, Heracles, said slowly. The name falls in three measured steps. The first is the goddess, the second is the bridge, the third is the word for what survives, what is spoken of, what is carried forward, what persists after the body, and the labors, and the divine scheming, and the serpents in the cradle, and the night, 3 times its natural length, have all settled into the past and become the property of whoever inherits the telling. Kleos, the thing that keeps being said. In Thebes, in the house where the oil lamp is burning low, and the shield cradle holds both infants on the clay floor, and the night is extending itself by divine arrangement past every natural limit. None of this has happened yet. The name Alcides is the name of the boy. The twin next to him is Iphicles, sleeping. The serpents have not arrived. The divine forces that have already been set in motion by Zeus's visit and Hera's intervention at Mycenae, and the premature arrival of a lesser child into a kingship intended for a greater one, are not yet visible in this room. They are present in the way that forces are present before they become events, but the room itself is ordinary. The lamp is ordinary. The 2 small human bodies breathing in the repurposed shield are ordinary. The tradition describes this world, the world of gods walking into houses wearing mortal faces, of nights extended by divine will to accommodate divine purposes, of serpents arriving in nurseries and infants strangling them without waking the household, with the calm, attentive interest of a record keeper who understands that these events occurred in the context of a particular cosmological order, a world in which the boundary between the divine and the mortal was not sealed, in which gods moved through ordinary rooms and left behind them consequences that played out across entire human lives. The house in Thebes was simply a house until a god entered it, and then it was the house where a child was conceived who would carry a goddess's name as his own and spend his mortal life in the shape of that contradiction, famous because she persecuted him, her glory because she could not stop him. The lamps in Thebes burn low toward morning. The night that should have ended hours ago continues at divine instruction. The darkness outside the house, maintained past the point where nature alone would have released it. The stars in their positions across a sky that has been held still longer than it was made to hold. The 2 infants in the shield cradle are both asleep. The household is quiet. Amphitryon is somewhere between the road and the house, carrying the tiredness of a campaign and the ordinary anticipation of a man returning home after a long absence, not yet aware of what the seer in the lamplight will shortly explain to him with the unhurried precision of someone who has already seen how it ends. The name that will replace Alcides is not yet known in Thebes. It is not yet spoken by anyone in the city. It waits, the way the labors wait, the way the serpents wait, the way Eurystheus waits in Mycenae, without yet knowing what function he is about to serve. Everything that will follow from this night, the accumulated weight of it, the fame that will exceed all ordinary human fame, the 12 labors that will carry a man to the edges of the world and back, is still ahead of the lamp and the shield and the sleeping children. The goddess whose name he will carry did not intend to give him anything. She intended, and would go on intending, the opposite. The name Heracles was not her gift. It was what the tradition found when it looked back at the full shape of what her hatred had accomplished, and understood that the word for what remained, the word for what persisted, what kept being spoken, what carried forward through the centuries in stone and lyric and written record, was the word kleos, glory, hers without her consent, his by the particular long patience embedded in a name. Lyssa stands at the entrance to a house in Thebes. In Euripides' tragedy, she is given a body, a name spoken aloud, and a speaking part, which is unusual even within a tradition that regularly gave form to the forces that moved through human lives. Most of what entered a person from outside did not appear on a stage and introduce itself. Lyssa does. She stands at the threshold, in full view, and before she crosses it, she speaks. What she says is not what might be expected from a divine agent arriving to carry out a goddess's command. She does not announce purpose with any enthusiasm. She does not move forward with the momentum of a figure who wants the thing she has been sent to do. Instead, Euripides gives her a speech that amounts to reluctance, a divine personification of madness, pausing at the doorway of a great man's house and saying, in effect, that she does not believe this is right. She names Heracles. She describes what she knows of him. She says that in all the time she has moved through the world, she has not found a man more worthy of being left alone. The goddess Iris stands beside her. Iris serves as the messenger of the Olympians, the divine intermediary through whom divine will reaches mortal life. And in this scene, she is Hera's instrument, present to ensure that what has been commanded is carried out. The two figures at the threshold represent a kind of argument rendered visible. Lyssa, the very spirit of frenzy, pulling back from her own nature. Iris, the messenger, committed to the message regardless of its content. Between them, the house waits in the ordinary stillness of a morning that does not yet know what is about to enter it. Heracles is inside. He has just returned from a journey that, by any measure of what human effort can accomplish, ought to have granted him some period of rest. He had descended into the underworld, the kingdom of Hades beneath the earth, which the Greeks understood as a genuine destination reached by a genuine road, not a metaphor, and he had come back from it, which was not a thing most mortals managed. He had returned to the city where his family lived. He had prepared to give thanks to Zeus. The altar fire was lit. The offerings were arranged. The gesture of gratitude was already organized in his hands. In Euripides' account, it is this specific moment that Hera chose. The prayer of thanks prepared for a father who had given his son strength enough to survive the underworld. That was the moment. It is one of the details in the myth that requires no interpretation, because the structure of it speaks plainly enough on its own. Lyssa crosses the threshold. What Euripides describes happening inside the house unfolds quickly in the telling, though its actual shape, the way it would have occupied real time in a real room, is harder to hold in the mind. What the play describes is this. Heracles, standing at the altar, turned strange. His eyes changed in the way described by ancient sources when divine interference moved into a mortal body, the stillness before it, then the absence of the person who had been there. He began to speak about enemies that were not present, enemies that could only have existed in a version of the world visible to the madness that had taken his sight. He moved through the interior of his own house as though it were a battlefield, and the people inside it as though they were what the frenzy made them appear to be. The children Heracles and Megara had made together were three, according to Apollodorus in the Bibliotheca. Their names were Therymachus, Creontiades, and Decun. Other ancient sources expand this number considerably. As many as 8 children appear in some accounts, though Apollodorus gives the 3 names with the specificity of a genealogical record. What Megara had made for them, what the household had accumulated in the way that households do, the ordinary objects of family life arranged in ordinary rooms, none of that is described in any surviving source, because none of it was what any ancient writer was recording. What they recorded was what Lyssa brought into the house when she crossed the threshold. Megara had married Heracles when he was young, before the labors, before the shape of his life had settled into the form the myths give it. Apollodorus records that she was the daughter of Creon, king of Thebes, and that the marriage came as a reward from Thebes itself. Heracles had defended the city against the minions of Orchomenus, the neighboring power that had been extracting tribute from Thebes, and the gratitude of the city had taken the form of a king's daughter. This was how such arrangements worked in the world the myths describe. She was given, and the household was made, and the children came, and for a period of time the house in Thebes contained something that resembled an ordinary life organized around an extraordinary person. None of that ordinary life is described in the myths with particular attention. It exists between the episodes, between the deed that won Megara and the madness that destroyed what the marriage had produced. What little can be inferred from the tradition is that Heracles was understood to have been a present father and a present husband, that the household was a real place with real people in it, and that what Lyssa entered that morning was not a grand or exceptional scene, but something modest and domestic, a man returning home, a fire prepared, children somewhere in the rooms of the house. The sacrificial fire outside the house had been set for Zeus. The tradition holds that Heracles had spent time in the underworld, performing the last of the tasks Eurystheus had set him, and the return from that particular journey carried its own specific weight. Coming back from the underworld meant something in the Greek mythological framework that no other return quite matched. The world of the dead was permanent. The shade that went down did not come back. In the ordinary course of things, that Heracles came back was testament to what he was, and the altar fire was the appropriate acknowledgement of that. A son returning to the light, turning toward his father in the sky, completing the gesture of gratitude before the household settled back into its ordinary shape. It was at this moment, in Euripides' telling, that the shape of the morning broke entirely. The altar fire continued to burn outside the house. The offerings remained where they had been placed. The gesture of thanks that Heracles had organized was simply never completed, left at the edge of its own beginning. The divine address abandoned mid-word, because what came through the door when Lyssa crossed the threshold occupied every room at once. In the version Apollodorus gives, there is no divine agent described entering the house. The account is brief and does not dwell. What Apollodorus records is that the madness arrived, the specific Greek word is mania, and that what followed within the house was the consequence of that arrival. No stage direction, no speaking personification pausing at the door to express her reservations. In Apollodorus, the madness simply comes, and Heracles performs in the grip of it what he performs, and then it is over. The difference between these two accounts is worth sitting with, because it is not merely a question of dramatic technique. Euripides, writing for an audience who would watch actors on a stage in the afternoon light of an Athenian theater, gave the frenzy a face and a voice and a moral hesitation because the dramatic form required that what was inside, the frenzy, the divine imposition, the mechanism of Hera's will, be made visible. Apollodorus, writing in a different register for a different purpose, recorded the event as a mythological fact without theatrical staging. In both accounts, the event itself does not change. What changes is what the frame allows the reader to see from the outside. What Euripides allows the audience to see is the moment when Athena acted. In the Euripidean account, before Heracles could reach Amphitryon, his mortal father, the Theban general who had raised him, who was present in the house, the goddess Athena intervened. She moved through the space of the drama in the way that gods moved in tragedy, not gradually, not incrementally, but in a single action that altered everything it touched. She hurled a stone, described in some translations as a great rock, in others as a specific kind of stone, associated with bringing a violent halt to what is in motion, and it struck Heracles and drove him to the ground, and the frenzy departed the room as suddenly as it had arrived. The silence after the stone landed in Euripides is one of those silences in ancient drama that is actually the most articulate part of the scene. Before the stone, the house in total disorder, the rooms wrong, the inside of the place containing what it now contained. After the stone, the same interior, newly quiet, with Heracles on the ground, and the frenzy gone out of him like a fire going out, not gradually but all at once, the way fire goes out when what was feeding it is removed. In Apollodorus, there is no stone and no divine intervention. What Apollodorus records is that Heracles collapsed into sleep and exhaustion, and that when he woke, Amphitryon was there. The ending of the madness in Apollodorus has the quality of a weather event, the kind of storm that breaks because the pressure changes, not because anyone stopped it. Whether it was a divine stone or simple exhaustion, what follows is the same. Heracles wakes in the house where he fell. He is bound, either by ropes Amphitryon had placed around him during the collapse, or by his own inability to move from the place where he landed. And the first thing the waking man sees is the interior of the room. The room contains what it contains. This moment in the tradition, the waking, the gradual assembly of understanding, the recognition spreading through a man coming back to himself in a house that has been entirely changed, while something else occupied his body, is handled by Euripides with a patience that the dramatic form demands and that the situation itself seems to require. The playwright does not rush the recognition. He allows it to move at the pace it would actually move, in a person waking from divine-imposed unconsciousness into a scene whose meaning cannot be taken in all at once. Heracles asks where he is. He asks what has happened. He asks about the objects he can see in the room, the broken things, the specific evidence of what the room contains. The play draws this out, not for dramatic effect in any cheap sense, but because the recognition needs time. What has been lost needs to be understood piece by piece, in the order that understanding actually arrives in a person coming out of sleep and into a truth that waking will not soften. Amphitryon speaks to him. This is one of the older man's functions in the Euripidean drama. He is the father who stays, the mortal man who remains in the room when the divine events have concluded, and the cleanup, in every sense of the word, falls to the people left standing. Amphitryon explains. He does it slowly. He does it in the way that a person explains an irreversible thing to someone who has not yet fully understood that it is irreversible, carefully, with attention to each step of the explanation, allowing the information to settle before the next piece is offered. Heracles, in Euripides, does not immediately accept what he is being told. This is also not a dramatic device, but an honest representation of how the human mind encounters information of a certain scale. The denial is not extended, and it is not performed as a kind of bargaining. It is simply the brief interval between hearing something and being able to hold it. The tradition gives it that small amount of space and then closes it. What Heracles comes to understand is this: under the influence of a divine-sent frenzy, in the grip of something that was not him and was not subject to his will, he had killed the people who were his. The children whose names Apollodorus records, Thermachus, Creontiades, Decune, were gone. Megara, his wife, was gone in some versions of the tradition, though Euripides handles her fate in a way that different translations render differently, and the question of her specific fate is one of the points on which the ancient sources do not converge. What the tradition holds as fixed across the variations is the loss of the children. The grief in Euripides after the recognition is given the quality of ancient tragedy at its most composed, which is to say, it is enormous, and it is held very still. Euripides does not allow Heracles to fall apart in the way that a modern dramatic treatment might, the wailing, the visible collapse of a man whose world has been taken from him all at once. What Euripides gives him instead is a grief that has already moved past its most violent first expression, because the recognition itself was slow enough that by the time it is complete, something in the figure of Heracles has already settled into the new shape of the world. Not acceptance, that is too calm a word, something more like the state a person enters when the thing has happened, and the mind knows it has happened, and there is nowhere else to go. The tradition holds that Heracles, in this state, considered not going anywhere, that he considered ending what remained of his own life, because the alternative, continuing to exist in a world where he was the instrument of what had happened in that house, did not seem like something that could be survived. This is recorded in Euripides with the same measured attention as everything else in the scene. It is not presented as a dramatic threat to be resolved quickly or as a gesture. The play treats it as the reasonable conclusion a man might reach from where Heracles now stood, given what the room contained and what he understood himself to have done, and it gives that conclusion time and weight before it moves to address it. It was Theseus who addressed it. Theseus, in the Greek mythological tradition, was himself a hero of the highest order, king of Athens, son of Aegeus, the man who had navigated the labyrinth at Knossos and killed the Minotaur, who had made the Saronic Gulf safe to travel by clearing it of the various monstrous figures who preyed on anyone attempting to cross it. He and Heracles are linked in the tradition as friends, which is a relationship the myths handle with a kind of matter-of-fact solidity. Two men of equivalent standing who had operated in the same mythological world, and who knew each other well enough for the friendship to have weight. In some accounts, Heracles had helped rescue Theseus from the underworld, which gave the friendship a specific and extraordinary depth that ordinary mortal friendships could not quite contain. Theseus was present in Thebes when the madness broke. The tradition does not explain the precise mechanism of his arrival, whether he had been visiting, whether he had been summoned, whether the timing was coincidental in the way that things in the mythological tradition are sometimes coincidental, which is to say, not at all. He was there. He came into the house. He found his friend on the floor of the room where the morning had ended. What Theseus does in Euripides' drama is not dramatic in any elevated sense. He sits down, he stays, he speaks, and what he speaks is not a philosophical argument for the value of continued existence or a speech designed to lift the emotional atmosphere of the scene. He speaks as one person speaks to another when the only thing available is proximity and honesty and the particular quality of presence that cannot be performed and cannot be substituted. He extends his hand toward Heracles in a gesture that the play describes as deliberate, a physical choice made in full knowledge of what miasma meant in the ancient Greek understanding of blood guilt and ritual pollution, the contamination that had entered Heracles through the shedding of family blood, and that would, according to the religious framework of the culture, transfer through contact. Theseus reached toward him anyway. This detail is not incidental. In the world the myths describe, the world in which miasma was not a metaphor, but a real and transmissible condition, in which contact with a person who carried blood guilt could draw that guilt toward you in a way that required its own subsequent purification. The choice to extend a hand was a choice with genuine theological consequences. Theseus knew what he was doing. He made the choice in full knowledge of it. The gesture meant, whatever you are carrying, I will be beside you in it, and the cost of that proximity is one I accept. Heracles, in Euripides, does not immediately respond to this gesture with any kind of shift in the scene's emotional temperature. The play does not offer a moment where the grief is visibly eased or the decision to remain in the world is announced with clarity. What happens is slower and quieter than that. Theseus speaks. He tells Heracles that grief of this magnitude does not disqualify a man from life, that the tradition holds examples, divine and mortal both, of figures who carried unbearable things and continued. He names gods. He names the specific framework of divine behavior that even the Olympians themselves were not exempt from, the violence and loss that moved through divine lives as it moved through mortal ones, and he does this not to diminish what Heracles has suffered, but to place it inside a world that is large enough to contain it. The speech is long, and Euripides allows it to be long. There is a quality in the Theban scene of Heracles that recognizes how much time an argument for remaining alive actually requires, that it cannot be made quickly, that it requires patience from both the speaker and the listener, that the person on the floor needs to hear, not a conclusion, but a whole long sequence of reasons laid out at the pace of someone who has no intention of being anywhere else until the conversation is finished. Heracles eventually speaks. The play records that he agreed to leave with Theseus, not that the grief was resolved or that the situation had changed in any material way, but that the choice between continuing and not continuing had been made, and that the choice was made in the direction of continuing, and that Theseus was the reason for it. The myth does not offer this as a triumphant moment. It is recorded with the same measured attention as everything else in the scene, a choice made in full knowledge of what it cost, by a man sitting in a room where his life had been entirely broken, with his friend sitting beside him. The play ends the scene there, in that room, before the journey to Delphi, and before the formal structure of penance has been introduced. Euripides is interested in what happens in the room. The tradition will carry Heracles forward from the room to the road, to the sanctuary on the slope of Parnassus, and the oracle will give his grief a direction and a shape and a duration and a name. But in Euripides, the moment that holds the longest is this one: the two men in the house, the altar fire still burning outside, the offerings still placed where Heracles had arranged them before the morning went wrong. There is a particular quality to the grief in the Heracles of Euripides that distinguishes it from how grief typically functions in the ancient dramatic tradition. Most tragic figures in Greek drama grieve the losses that have been imposed on them by fate, by their own choices, by the movement of divine will through a life that had its own particular shape. The grief has an origin and a logic and a trajectory. Oedipus grieves the truth he uncovered. Hecuba grieves the fall of Troy. The source of the grief in both cases is something the character can understand and name and move toward or away from. Heracles' grief in Euripides is different because its object is also its subject. He is grieving what he did, which means he is grieving himself, not the self that was there before the madness arrived, because that self is continuous with him and knew nothing of what was happening, but the hands, the body, the physical fact of what those hands and that body did in the grip of Lyssa's presence in the house. The tradition is careful about this. Apollodorus does not assign guilt to Heracles in a moral sense. The madness was divine in origin, externally imposed, entirely outside his will or knowledge or consent. The theological framework of miasma did not require personal guilt in the way that moral frameworks might. What it required was the fact of the blood. The ritual pollution came from the act, not the intention behind the act. And yet Euripides is also interested in what a man of Heracles' nature would do with the moral weight of it, not the theological weight, not the question of ritual contamination, but the entirely personal and ordinary human question of what it means to have been the instrument through which something this large happened, regardless of whose will was behind the instrument. The play holds both of these things at once without resolving the tension between them. The tradition says, "It was not your fault." The man himself says, "These were my hands." Theseus, sitting beside him, does not try to resolve that tension. He sits with it. He speaks into it without simplifying it. He remains in the house where the frenzy came and left, and where the ordinary objects of a household now share the room with the evidence of what the morning held. He remains there, not as a divine figure, or a figure of authority, or a figure with a solution, but as a man who had known this other man long enough to know that leaving was not the right thing to do. The myths will carry Heracles forward from this room, the road out of Thebes and up toward the mountain sanctuary, the narrow way through the olive groves on the lower slopes of Parnassus, the air of the high place where Apollo kept his oracle. All of that is ahead. The oracle will speak a sentence that gives the grief a structure. 12 years with a beginning and a far edge, a destination and a purpose, and at the far edge of it, a word the Pythia uses that Heracles has not yet heard, applied to himself. The world will eventually move forward from the house in Thebes, but in Euripides, the play stays in the room a moment longer. The altar fire is still burning outside. The offerings are still there, the gesture of thanks that Heracles had organized before the morning broke, the acknowledgement of return from the underworld that never became the prayer it was preparing to be. Nobody has gone outside to the altar yet. Nobody has addressed what the fire is still waiting for. The scene simply holds this detail without comment, the fire continuing, the world outside the house going on in the ordinary way of the world, outside a house, unaware of or indifferent to the specific weight of what the interior contains. The Theseus does not go to the fire. Hercules does not go to the fire. The play does not return to the altar or explain what eventually becomes of the offerings, or whether the gratitude was expressed at some later time, or whether it simply was not. The fire burns. It is a detail at the edge of the scene that the tradition places there, and then does not resolve, the piety of the morning still present in the physical form of the flame, the gesture of the man who prepared it still visible in the careful arrangement of the offerings, while the man himself sits on the floor of his own house with his friend beside him and the weight of the morning around him on all sides. The dramatic tradition in ancient Greece understood something about how grief and ordinary objects exist in the same room at the same time. The fire at the altar is not symbolic in any labored sense. It is a fire. It was prepared by a man who came home from the underworld and wanted to give thanks, and now it is burning in the ordinary way of fires that have been started and not attended. And the man who started it is inside the house where Lyssa came and went, and his friend is sitting beside him on the floor, and neither of them is going to the altar right now. This is what Euripides holds at the end of the scene. Not the fire as metaphor, not the friend as symbol. The physical, particular fact of a fire burning outside a house where something has happened, and a man who cannot yet go to it, and another man who has decided to remain until the first man can. The myth will continue from here. The road is ahead. The oracle on the mountain is ahead. The 12 years and the far edge of them are ahead. What is here, in this scene, in the version of the tradition Euripides recorded, is the thing that happens before all of that, the part that happens in the room, while the altar fire burns outside and Theseus sits on the floor of the ruined house and does not leave. He stays. That is the particular fact the tradition holds on to. Among everything that happened in and around Heracles in the course of the long mythological record, the gods who used him, the goddess who persecuted him, the oracle that directed him, the king who assigned him 12 years of labor at the edges of the known world. This is a human fact, small by comparison and made entirely of choice. A friend sitting on the floor, not leaving, speaking quietly into the silence of the room, remaining in the presence of grief that was too large for any single person to carry. For no reason the tradition records other than the simple and ancient and durable fact that this was his friend, and the friend needed him there, and so he stayed. The road to Delphi rises in long, slow curves through the lower slopes of Mount Parnassus, and olive trees grow along both sides of it in the particular gray-green way they grow in Greece, their leaves turning silver when the wind moves through them. The road was called the Sacred Way, and pilgrims had been walking it for centuries before any particular traveler arrived. The stones worn smooth in places by the accumulated passage of sandaled feet, the path itself carrying the memory of every question that had ever been brought up this hill to be answered. Above the trees, the temple was visible long before a traveler reached it, its pale columns set against the limestone cliffs of the mountain, catching whatever light the sky offered. A traveler arriving from the east would first see the temenos, the sacred precinct that surrounded the temple, its walls containing a complex of treasuries, statues, and votive offerings accumulated over generations of grateful or desperate or pious visitors from every part of the Greek world. The treasury buildings stood at intervals along the path inside the precinct, small stone structures housing the offerings of particular city-states. Corinth had one, Athens had one, Sipnos had one that was especially ornate, and a traveler walking among them before reaching the temple itself moved through a kind of compressed geography of the Greek world, each building a stone argument for one city's relationship with Apollo. By the time the temple doors came into view, the traveler had already understood something about the scale of what the oracle represented, not the private property of any single place, but a center to which the whole Greek-speaking world oriented itself, the way iron filings orient to a point of magnetic force. Inside the temple, past the great hall with its inscriptions carved into the pronaos wall. Know thyself, nothing in excess. These phrases recorded for centuries by visitors who understood them as the god's own counsels. There was a smaller, lower room. The Greeks called it the atone. Modern archaeological work at the site has identified a geological fault running beneath the temple precinct, and ancient visitors consistently described the air inside the sanctuary as carrying some quality unlike ordinary air, the kind of description that accumulates across sources in ways that suggest a genuine sensory experience rather than conventional religious language. The Pythia, Apollo's high priestess, sat on a bronze tripod set above the narrow opening where the fault met the surface, and the vapors rising from the earth may have carried compounds capable of inducing an altered perceptual state. The ancient world's understanding of the mechanism was theological, Apollo speaking through a consecrated woman, but the physical conditions that attended the process appear to have been real. The tripod, the narrow room, the quality of the air, and the woman already in a trance state receiving questions from the world's most prominent political figures, generals, and private suppliants. This was the machinery through which Apollo spoke, or through which, depending on how a particular ancient Greek framed it, the god allowed what he already knew to enter human hearing. Heracles arrived at Delphi, carrying the thing that nearly everyone who came to the oracle was carrying, a condition for which ordinary life offered no remedy. The tradition holds that in the aftermath of the killing, he had withdrawn from human contact, taken himself away from the city of Thebes, and from the people who had known him in the life he had now destroyed, and existed in a kind of suspended state that ancient Greek culture recognized as the natural consequence of carrying miasma, the ritual pollution that attached itself to anyone who had shed family blood. The concept of miasma has no precise equivalent in modern usage. It was not guilt in the psychological sense, though guilt was present. It was not sin in the theological sense, though the Greeks understood that certain acts disturbed the order the gods preferred. Miasma was closer to contamination, a disturbance in the proper arrangement of things that settled on a person like a physical substance, making them unfit to participate in religious rites, to enter temples, to sit at ordinary tables in ordinary houses, without spreading the disturbance outward to everyone around them. The person carrying miasma was not simply morally compromised. They were ritually dangerous, in the way that a vessel holding something corrosive is dangerous, not wicked in itself, but capable of damage by proximity. The practical consequence of this understanding was that a person in the state Heracles was in, after the killing, could not simply resolve to do better, could not grieve privately, and return to ordinary life when the grief had passed, could not be reassured by friends that he bore no real responsibility for what had happened under divine-imposed madness. The miasma existed independently of intention. The blood had been shed, the disturbance was present, and the only thing that moved miasma was catharsis, a formal, specific, religiously sanctioned process of purification that dissolved the contamination and restored the person to a state in which ordinary life could resume. Catharsis could take various forms in ancient Greek practice, ranging from relatively simple ritual washings for minor infractions to elaborate processes prescribed by the Delphic oracle itself for cases of the most serious blood pollution. What Heracles carried required the latter. He was, by any measure the ancient world applied to these matters, someone whose pollution was as complete as it was possible for pollution to be. Family blood, multiple deaths, shed in a moment of divine imposed blindness that the sufferer could not have prevented, and also could not claim exempted him from the consequence. The oracle at Delphi was the appropriate authority for this kind of case. It had been receiving cases like this for a very long time. The Pythia's instruction, as Apollodorus records it in the Bibliotheca, was specific in the way that oracular instructions often appeared to be, more specific in retrospect than they probably were in the moment of delivery. Heracles was to go to Tiryns. He was to present himself to Eurystheus, king of the Argolid, and place himself in Eurystheus's service for 12 years, performing whatever tasks the king commanded. The formulation is important. Not a task, not a season, not a limited and clearly bounded assignment, but whatever tasks the king commanded, for 12 years, with the duration set at the outset, and the content left entirely to the authority of a man who had no reason to make any of this easy. This was the shape the purification would take. Not a bath, not a ceremony, not a sacrifice at a particular altar, but 12 years of subordination to a king whose authority over Heracles derived from an arrangement that even the gods acknowledged was unfair. The Pythia also told him, according to Apollodorus, that the completion of the labors would earn him something he had not been promised in ordinary life: immortality. The word was there, at the far end of 12 years, and however many tasks a frightened, resentful king decided to assign. Whether Heracles heard that word and believed it, or heard it and set it aside in the way that people in states of great grief set aside information that concerns a future they cannot yet imagine, the tradition does not record. What the tradition does preserve is the weight of that moment on the slope of Parnassus. A man with a direction where before there had been only the formless expanse of what could not be undone. The oracle had given the pollution a structure. It had given the grief a shape that could be moved through. The 12 years were terrible to contemplate, and the king at the center of them was a man whose authority Heracles had every reason to find humiliating. But humiliation was, in the framework the oracle was applying, the point. The catharsis that applied to what Heracles had done could not be administered quickly or comfortably. It required the full duration, the complete subordination, and the completion of whatever the king assigned. The tradition held that all of this was, in the deepest sense, the correct response to the situation, not punishment in the modern sense, not a court's verdict, but a prescription, the way a physician prescribes a course of treatment that is necessary, regardless of whether the patient considers themselves responsible for the illness. The renaming happened at Delphi. This is one of the details that Apollodorus and other sources have carried carefully, understanding it as significant in a way that goes beyond the biographical. Heracles had been born with a different name, Alcides, meaning a descendant of Alcaeus, his maternal grandfather, a name that placed him in the ordinary lineage of a heroic Theban family and connected him to the mortal world of Theban generals and Perseus descendants, and a specific place in a specific city's history. Alcides was the name of a child. It was the name of the infant in the shield cradle, the boy who trained in music and wrestling and chariot driving, the young man who married Megara and built a life in Thebes that the divine interference of a goddess then undid completely. At Delphi, that name was set aside and the new name was given, Heracles, a compound of Hera and Kleos, meaning glory of Hera, a name that embedded the source of his suffering directly into the identity the oracle was constructing for him. The naming is strange to sit with. It would be stranger still if the name had been given by the goddess herself, as an act of deliberate rebranding, Hera acknowledging in some formal way that her persecution had produced something worth naming, but it was not given by Hera. It was given at Apollo's sanctuary, delivered through Apollo's priestess, and what it encoded was not the goddess's acknowledgement, but the tradition's recognition of a long, patient structural irony that would only become fully visible at the very end of the story. The name told the truth about what Heracles would become, stated at the moment of beginning, before a single labor had been completed, when the only available evidence suggested that Hera's relationship with Heracles was one of relentless divine hostility. The name was a promise written in irony, which is a kind of writing the ancient Greek mythological tradition was particularly good at. Statements whose full meaning could only be read from the far end of the story they described. Alcides had been the name of the man who lived in Thebes and had a family and a life in the city where he was born. Heracles was the name of the man walking away from Delphi with a destination, Tiryns, 12 years, a king, and at the far end of whatever the king required, the word immortality, sitting in the middle distance, like a city glimpsed from a very long road. The old name had belonged to a particular person in a particular place. The new name belonged to something the tradition understood as pan-Hellenic, not a Theban hero, but a Greek hero, not a regional figure with a local cult, but a civilizing force whose labors would extend outward from the northeastern Peloponnese until they reached the edges of the world the ancient Greeks could imagine. The city toward which Heracles was walking had its own history, and that history was visible from a considerable distance. Tiryns stands in the northeastern Peloponnese on a low limestone ridge above what was once a coastal plain, and its walls are among the most physically impressive surviving structures from the Bronze Age Greek world. Pausanias Firmidipristhi, Pausanias Firmididatit, Pausanias Firminid War. There's Oldeford the Seidel, the traveler and geographer, writing in the 2nd century of the Common Era, visited the site and described the walls as Cyclopean, built, in the explanation ancient Greeks found most plausible, by the one-eyed giants, because no ordinary human construction program could account for the scale of what was there. The limestone blocks that form the main walls are enormous, some of them weighing multiple tons, fitted together without mortar, in courses so massive that the walls rise in some sections to 7 meters in height, their exterior faces presenting a near vertical surface of fitted stone to anyone approaching from the plain below. Modern archaeology has confirmed Tiryns as a genuine center of Mycenaean palatial authority during the Late Bronze Age, a real place with real administrative functions, where real kings exercised real power over a real territory. The mythological tradition placed Eurystheus in those walls, and the walls were genuinely impressive enough that the placement required no imaginative effort. Eurystheus was waiting. He had, according to the tradition, been waiting for Heracles since the day of the births, since Hera's manipulation of the timing that had placed a lesser child into the kingship that Zeus had intended for a greater one. The mechanics of that arrangement were clear enough in the oldest sources. Hera had intervened in the natural order of 2 deliveries, happening nearly simultaneously, accelerating the birth of Nisipe's child in Mycenae and delaying the birth of Alcmene's child in Thebes, so that the political reality on the ground, which child had emerged first, matched what Hera wanted rather than what Zeus had promised. Zeus himself acknowledged this in Homer's Iliad, in the 19th book, in a passage where he speaks of being deceived by Hera into making a vow whose fulfillment she then controlled by controlling the sequence of events. The king in Tiryns held his kingship not because he was the best suited to hold it, but because a goddess had manipulated a biological process to ensure that he arrived in the world a few hours ahead of the child, who was supposed to arrive first. Eurystheus was, in consequence, fully aware of the source of his authority over Heracles. Diodorus Siculus notes in the Bibliotheca Historica that the king understood himself to be acting as an instrument of Hera's ongoing management of the situation, a mortal proxy through whom the goddess continued a project that had begun before either man could walk. This awareness did not produce in Eurystheus any particular magnanimity or even the ordinary dignity of a man confident in his own position. It produced instead a famous cowardice that became one of the tradition's most persistent details. The bronze pithos, the large storage jar buried in the earth of the palace courtyard, with its rim at ground level, into which the king would descend whenever Heracles returned with proof of a completed task. The lid could be pulled across from inside. The darkness in the jar was complete. The footsteps in the courtyard above were audible, and Heracles' instructions for the next labor were communicated not by the king himself, but by Coprius, Eurystheus' herald, whose name derived from the Greek word for dung, a small, deliberate, traditional judgment embedded in the character's nomenclature by sources who had strong feelings about the quality of the men involved. Against those walls, and in service to that king, Heracles arrived and presented himself according to the oracle's instruction. The tradition does not preserve what this first meeting looked like in practical terms, whether Eurystheus was already in the Pythos when the hero arrived, whether they spoke through the herald from the beginning, whether there was any formal acknowledgement of the arrangement's origins and divine fraud. What the tradition does preserve is the structural fact of the arrangement, a man of extraordinary capability placed in complete formal subordination to a man of no particular capability for 12 years, performing tasks designed not to accomplish anything Eurystheus genuinely needed accomplished, but to extend the suffering. Hera had been administering since the cradle. The labors that followed were not agricultural policy. They were not defensive military assignments. They were, from Eurystheus's perspective, impossible requests, the kinds of things a person assigns when they want the assigned task to fail, because failure would mean the labors didn't count, and the 12 years would extend further, and every extension was more time in which something fatal might happen to the servant whose life Hera wanted to reduce. The ancient Greek religious logic underneath this arrangement deserves a moment's attention because it holds the whole structure in place. The oracle had not prescribed the labors as entertainment or as spectacle or as a kind of divine testing of Heracles' limits, though all of those readings have attached themselves to the tradition across time. The oracle had prescribed a specific course of action for addressing a specific form of ritual contamination. The contamination was real in the terms of ancient Greek religious belief. The remedy was proportionate to the scale of the contamination, not a single task, not a year of service, but 12 years and whatever the king required, because the pollution that needed dissolving was among the most serious the tradition recognized. The religious framing is important precisely because it prevents the arrangement from being read as simply cruel. It was not cruel in the way that purely arbitrary suffering is cruel. It was prescribed, structured, and pointed toward a specific outcome, the catharsis that would restore Heracles to a state in which ordinary divine and social order could resume, and beyond which the oracle had promised something further waited. The 12 years that followed carried Heracles outward from Tiryns in an expanding arc that the tradition traced across the whole map of the ancient Greek world, and beyond it. The labors that Eurystheus assigned moved progressively further from the Argolid, from the lion on the slopes of Nemea, close enough to Tiryns that the distance could be covered in a day, outward to Lerna's swamp, to Cyrenia's woods, to the marshes of Stymphalus, to the island of Crete, to the Thracian coast, and eventually to places that sat at the very edge of Greek geographical imagination, the far western island of Erythea, where the cattle of Geryon grazed at the margin of the world, and the garden of the Hesperides, where the golden apples grew in a country that geography could point toward, but not precisely locate. And below all of it, beneath the world entirely, Cerberus waited at the boundary of the kingdom of the dead. The outward movement is one of the things the tradition seems to have understood about itself, that the labors were not simply a list of difficult tasks, but a progressive expansion of the known world's circumference, each labor pushing the boundary of what was considered reachable a little further than it had been. The northeastern Peloponnese, where Eurystheus sat in his palace and his Pythos, was the center of the map. Each labor moved Heracles further from that center. By the time the cycle was complete, the world that had been traced was the whole world. Everything inside it reached. Every edge of it touched. The underworld itself added to the territory of what one man had moved through. The oracle had given Heracles the instruction to go to Tiryns. The oracle had given him the word immortality to carry, and the oracle had given him, in doing both of those things, the particular gift that is available to a person who has suffered an unendurable loss and cannot find a shape for what comes after it, a structure, not happiness, not the restoration of what was lost, not a revision of what had already happened, but a direction and a duration, and the knowledge that at the far end of both of them, something the oracle had named would be waiting. The road down from Delphi descended through the same olive trees the road up had passed through, the leaves still turning silver in whatever wind came down from the mountain, the stone of the path still smooth from the passage of all the feet that had come this way before, and all the feet that would come after. The name Heracles was new. It sat on him differently than the old name had, not yet worn in, not yet the name other people used without thinking, not yet the name he recognized as his own when he heard it spoken in a marketplace or across a courtyard. The name Alcides had been the name of a boy from Thebes. The name Heracles was the name of a person the oracle was describing, someone whose story was not yet complete, whose identity was not yet settled into the shape that would eventually allow the irony of the name's meaning to become visible. Glory of Hera. The goddess whose name formed the first part of the compound had sent the serpents and manipulated the births and dispatched Lyssa and arranged the servitude, and none of those arrangements had produced in her the intention to give Heracles anything resembling glory. The name carried a future that the present contained no evidence for, but names in the mythological tradition often do this. They carry the truth about a person in a form the person cannot yet read, delivered at the moment when the truth is least visible, held in the syllables until the story catches up to what the name already knew. The priests and priestesses at Delphi had been receiving people in states of pollution and suffering and confusion and desperation for a very long time, and the instructions they delivered, drawn from whatever combination of tradition, geological vapor, ritual knowledge, and genuine divine contact, one believes the process involved, had a quality of long patience about them, the patience of an institution that understood that the remedies for the most serious conditions took time to work and could not be hurried without undermining their own effectiveness. 12 years was a long time to hold a name whose meaning was not yet available. 12 years was a long time to spend in service to a frightened king in a jar, but the oracle had set the terms, and the terms were the terms, and the alternative, remaining in the state of contamination indefinitely, unable to enter temples, or sit at tables, or participate in the ordinary life of a person who was not carrying a disturbance in the order of things, was not an alternative that the tradition's logic permitted Hercules to choose. The labors were the remedy. The remedy required the full course of treatment. The tradition's patience with that requirement is one of the things that makes the ancient Greek theological understanding of miasma and catharsis worth sitting with carefully, because it refuses the shortcuts that grief often reaches for: the private resolution, the internal conclusion, the decision to consider oneself finished with a process that has not yet been completed. Heracles stood in the open air outside the sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi, on the slope of Mount Parnassus, on a day that the tradition does not date and does not describe in its atmospheric particulars, and the direction he was facing was south and west, toward the Peloponnese, toward Tiryns, toward a king who had been waiting, toward 12 years of whatever a frightened, divinely favored man with access to a buried bronze jar chose to assign. The mountains around the oracle site were large and old. The olive trees on the lower slopes moved in the wind with the silver patience they had maintained through every season anyone on this road had ever observed them. The sanctuary behind him contained the tripod and the fault in the rock and the particular quality of air that ancient visitors had noticed and described across centuries. And ahead of him, the road descended, and the distance to Tiryns was measurable, and the 12 years were about to begin. The word the Pythia had used, immortality, was now somewhere in the road ahead, too far to be seen clearly, visible only in the way that very distant things are visible on clear days in Greece, as a shape against a further background rather than a legible object. He had a name that was new. He had a destination that was fixed. He had a duration that was defined. The orientation was complete, where before there had been only the formless expanse of what had happened and what could not be undone. The oracle had given the suffering a shape that time could move through, and Heracles began to walk, and the mountain continued to be what it had always been behind him, and the road continued to be what it had always been beneath his feet. And somewhere to the south, the great walls of Tiryns waited, enormous and old, with the Pythos already set into the courtyard earth, and the king already knowing that the servant the oracle had prescribed was on his way. The walls of Tiryns are still standing, not in ruin, exactly, though time has done what time does, but still present, still themselves, rising from the flat plain of the northeastern Peloponnese in courses of limestone so massive that a person walking beside them today has to adjust their whole sense of scale. The blocks are not shaped with particular care. They were not trimmed smooth or fitted with artisan precision. They are simply enormous, each one weighing several tons, some measuring 3 meters in length, stacked without mortar in horizontal courses that have held their position across more than 3,000 years. A visitor standing at the base of the outer wall and pressing a hand against the stone finds that the stone does not feel like architecture. It feels like geology. It feels like something that was not built so much as deposited, as though the earth had pushed it up from below, rather than any human agency having arranged it from above. The ancient Greeks who visited Tiryns in the classical period had the same feeling, and they drew the same conclusion that anyone might draw when faced with something too large to have been made by ordinary people. Pausanias, writing his description of Greece in the 2nd century of the Common Era, paused at these walls and noted with characteristic plainness that they were the work of the Cyclopes, the one-eyed giants, the beings who appeared in the tradition as the makers of things too large for human hands. He did not say this as metaphor. He said it as the obvious explanation for a fact that required one. Modern archaeology has confirmed that the site is a genuine center of Mycenaean palatial authority from the late Bronze Age, one of the most significant such sites in the Aegean world, inhabited and fortified across centuries. The walls were built by people, But Pausanias was right that they do not feel like it. This is the city in which Eurystheus waited, not with any particular pleasure, according to the sources that describe him, not with the easy confidence of a king who has earned his position through the ordinary channels by which kings earn positions, through battle, through inheritance accepted without complication, through the steady accumulation of legitimate authority over years. Eurystheus held his kingship over the Argolide by a margin of minutes, and the tradition is explicit about how that margin was manufactured. The arrangement between his birth and the birth intended to precede it was not a natural event. It was managed. The goddess Hera had applied pressure at the precise biological moment that would determine everything, and the result was that a lesser child arrived first and inherited what had been promised to another. This is the origin from which his authority descended, and the tradition never allows either Eurystheus or the listener to forget it. He was the son of Sthenelus, king of Mycenae, and Nisipe, who was the daughter of Pelops, which made him, working the lineage out carefully, a great-grandson of Perseus, the same Perseus who killed the Gorgon Medusa and founded the Perseid dynasty, from which both the king of Mycenae and the hero from Thebes ultimately descended. A shared ancestor is not a small thing in the mythological framework of ancient Greece. It bound figures together across generations in a web of obligation and competition and divine attention, and it meant that the situation between Eurystheus and Heracles was not simply a king managing a servant, but two cousins many times removed, both carrying the blood of the same foundational hero, finding themselves on entirely opposite sides of a divine arrangement neither of them had chosen. Eurystheus had the throne, Heracles had the labors. The ancestor they shared had killed a monster at the edge of the world and returned with its head, and here were his descendants, separated by a pithos sunk into the earth of a courtyard. The pithos deserves a moment of attention because it is one of the most quietly remarkable images in the whole tradition. Apollodorus, compiling his account of the myths in the Bibliotheca, records that Eurystheus had a large bronze storage jar, a pithos, the kind of deep vessel used across the ancient world for the long-term storage of grain and oil and wine, buried in the earth at Tiryns, with its rim set at ground level, large enough for a grown man to lower himself inside and pull some form of covering across the opening. And when Heracles returned from each completed labor, when the footsteps of the hero were heard approaching the palace, when the evidence of an impossible task accomplished was visible to anyone standing in the courtyard, Eurystheus would descend into this jar. He would climb down into the bronze dark of it and wait there, below ground level, with the sounds of the world muffled above him, until the danger of having to face the returning hero in person had passed. The tradition offers this detail without special comment. Apollodorus records it with the same even tone he uses to record everything else, and yet the image holds something that does not need emphasis to be felt. A king inside a jar, at the bottom of a vessel meant for grain, waiting in the dark for the footsteps above him to recede. The walls of Tiryns were built by the Cyclopes, or by something that might as well have been the Cyclopes, and the man who ruled inside them had prepared, in advance of the hero's first arrival, a bronze hole in the ground to hide in. He had the jar buried before Heracles ever came. This means the fear preceded the labors. He was afraid before the first task was assigned, before the first monster was confronted, before any evidence existed that Heracles would actually succeed in anything. The preparation of the pithos tells the listener everything the tradition wants them to know about Eurystheus, that his authority was borrowed from a goddess, that he understood this himself, and that the borrowed nature of it made him small in the way that borrowed authority usually does. It is worth sitting with the particular quality of this smallness, because the tradition does not present it as tragedy. There is no pathos in the image of Eurystheus in his jar. The myths that preserve him do not ask for sympathy, nor do they frame his position as one of genuine suffering. He is, in the mythological account, a man whose function is structural. He is the instrument through which a goddess conducts a sustained program of persecution across 12 years, and his own inner life is not especially the subject. Diodorus Siculus, in his Bibliotheca Historica, is fairly clear about this. Eurystheus understood that Hera's favor was the source of his authority, which made him not an independent antagonist with his own grievance, but a mortal conducting a divine agenda, a mouthpiece through which orders arrived that had been composed somewhere much further up. He was the formal mechanism. The actual author of the labors was elsewhere and older and not afraid of Heracles at all, or perhaps afraid in a way that a goddess can be afraid, which is to say, not afraid for her safety, but concerned about her narrative, about the direction things were moving, about a hero whose fame kept growing with every task completed. The fame was growing because the tasks were impossible, and he was completing them. This is the central irony embedded in the arrangement between Hera and Eurystheus, and the tradition surfaces it without needing to underline it. The harder the tasks, the more extraordinary the completion, and the more extraordinary the completion, the more kleos, the more glory attached to the name of the man who performed them. A king hiding in a jar cannot diminish a hero who has just returned from the edge of the earth. The pythos is an image of diminishment, but it diminishes only its occupant. Eurystheus underground, while Heracles stands in the courtyard above. This is a picture of who is actually larger, and it does not require any dramatic framing to see it clearly. Between Eurystheus and Heracles, there stood a herald. This detail from the tradition is worth attending to, because the herald is not a neutral figure, and his name is not a neutral name. Coprius, the word comes from the Greek for dung, and Apollodorus and other sources apply it without apparent discomfort to the man Eurystheus employed to relay all commands to Heracles rather than deliver them himself. Homer mentions Coprius in the 15th book of the Iliad, identifying him briefly as a man of poor character in service to an unworthy king. The combination of the king who will not show his face and the herald whose name references filth produces, in the mythological imagination, a kind of double portrait of a court defined by what it lacks: dignity, directness, the willingness to stand in the same space as the figure being commanded. Copreus would walk out from the gates of Tiryns bearing the instructions for the next labor. He would deliver them to Heracles, who would listen. Then Copreus would walk back through the gates, and Eurystheus, if he had risen from the Pythos for the occasion, would descend again. Consider the gate of Tiryns for a moment as a physical threshold. The site as it exists today still has its entrance passages, narrow corridors cut through the thickness of the wall, the limestone rising on both sides. The passage angled so that an attacker entering could not charge straight through, but had to turn, exposing his sword arm to the defenders above. The gate was a mechanism of control, a place where the inside and the outside negotiated their boundaries. Coprius passing through it outward toward Heracles, and then inward again, back toward the king in his jar, traced the same boundary across and back, again and again across 12 years. The gate was the hinge of the whole arrangement. The king on one side of it, the hero on the other, and the herald moving between them in both directions, carrying words that the king would not speak in person. Outside the gate, the world was large. This is worth stating plainly because it is easy to become absorbed in the Corinthian courtyard, the pythos, the herald, the managed distance between king and hero, and to forget that on the other side of the gate, beyond the walls, the world, the labors moved through extended in every direction farther than the tradition's imagination could resolve into clarity. The labors ranged across a geography that began in the northeastern Peloponnese and moved outward in a pattern of widening reach. The earliest assignments kept Heracles in familiar territory, the swamps and forests and mountain slopes of the Argolid and its near neighbors. But the pattern did not stay local. Task by task, the geography expanded to Thrace in the north, to Crete across the sea, to the far coastline of the Black Sea, to the island of Erythea in the far western ocean, beyond the pillars the tradition understood as the edge of the Mediterranean world, and eventually to the Garden of the Hesperides, which the tradition places somewhere beyond the western horizon in a location that has no fixed coordinates because it belongs to mythological rather than physical geography. The labors traced an outward spiral from Turin's through the entire known world and then out past the edges of it. Eurystheus, in his jar, had sent Heracles to the edge of the world and beyond it. The irony of this is structural rather than emotional. A man who hid in a bronze vessel had assigned tasks that required walking to the limit of what the ancient Greeks understood as the inhabitable earth, and the man assigned those tasks had completed them one by one and come back each time through the same gate where Corpurius was waiting. The disproportion between the assigner and the assigned work is one of the tradition's most sustained arrangements, and it holds across 12 years without collapsing. Heracles descended into the lineage of his assigned king through the shared ancestor both of them carried, and the mythological tradition holds this shared descent with a certain persistent attention. Perseus, the great-grandfather of both, or close enough to it that the lineage functions the same way, was himself a hero who killed a monster at the edge of the world and returned. The Gorgon Medusa, whose face turned the living to stone, whose island was somewhere beyond ordinary navigation, whose death required a set of divine assists that Heracles' labors would in some ways echo. A hero and a monster and a return carrying proof of the impossible. Perseus had done this. He had founded a dynasty, and from that dynasty had come a king who hid from heroes in jars, and a hero who walked to the edge of the earth and came back, and between them the whole arrangement that the tradition calls the 12 labors. What Eurystheus made of Heracles' returns is not extensively described. The tradition is more interested in the hero's departures and arrivals than in the king's internal state during the interval. But certain episodes surface with enough frequency across the sources that they can be set alongside the image of the pythos and held there quietly. When Heracles brought back the Erymanthian boar, one of the early labors, the capture of a living animal rather than the killing of a monster, and dragged the boar into the courtyard of Turince alive, Eurystheus's response, according to Apollodorus, was to leap into the pythos in terror. A living boar in the courtyard. The king of Mycenae, ruler of the Argolid, great-grandson of Perseus, descending into his bronze hole at the sight of an animal Heracles was holding by its tusks. The image is not offered as a moment of dramatic tension. It is offered as a fact, and the fact is quietly sufficient to make the point. The point is not that Eurystheus was contemptible. Exactly. The tradition is not primarily interested in condemning him. He is a small figure by the measure of the myth, and small figures in the mythological tradition tend to function as containers for structural meaning rather than as moral examples. Eurystheus's smallness shows the listener something about scale, about the difference between authority derived from divine manipulation and authority earned through the kind of sustained, outward moving confrontation with impossible things that defines Heracles' movement through the world. The king's fear is the measure of what the hero has become. Every time Eurystheus descends into the jar, the listener receives a small calibration, a reminder of the proportions involved, and the proportions were not symmetrical. They were never meant to be. Hera, who had set the entire arrangement in motion by managing the births of both men, had chosen as her mortal instrument a person whose character was precisely unsuited to the magnitude of what was being asked. Eurystheus was not equipped to stand in the presence of what the labors were making. The tradition is not entirely without sympathy for him on this point. It is genuinely difficult to receive. In your own courtyard, a hero returning from the underworld, dragging a three-headed dog behind him. But the sympathy, such as it is of the mild and observational kind. The man was frightened. He had always been frightened. The jar had been waiting in the ground before Heracles ever came, and it would remain there until the whole arrangement concluded, and Eurystheus spent his portion of those 12 years doing what he had always been equipped to do, sitting in the dark of a bronze vessel, listening to the sounds from above, waiting for the footsteps to pass. Heracles, in the meantime, was not alone in all of this. The tradition places beside him, on at least several of the labors, his nephew Iolaus, the son of Iphicles, who was the brother Heracles had shared a cradle with in the Theban nursery when they were infants. Iolaus served as charioteer and companion, and his presence in the stories is of a particular and practical kind. He holds torches, drives the chariot, assists with the material difficulties of a task in progress. He is not a second hero in the sense of performing the central deeds. Those belong to Heracles alone, but he is present, which in the mythological world is its own form of significance. To be present beside a person conducting an impossible task is to be inside the story of that task, and Iolaus is inside several of them. In Thebes, the city where both of them had their origin, the tradition associated Heracles with a gymnasium that carried Iolaus's name, the Iolaion, a colonnaded space where athletes trained, and where the heroic cult of Heracles was observed across generations. The gymnasium was a living structure in the sense that it had ongoing function in the community. Athletes used it. Ceremonies took place within it. The name above the entrance was spoken aloud in the ordinary course of daily life. A nephew's name given to a building dedicated to his uncle's worship in the city that had shaped them both before the labors scattered them across the width of the known world. This is the kind of specific historical texture that sits beside the mythological narrative and gives it a particular weight. The stories happened in the world that made places and kept them. Cobrius, walking back through the gate with another set of instructions to deliver on his next circuit, was conducting a program that a goddess had authored. The tradition is consistent on this point across its major sources. Diodorus Siculus treats Hera's orchestration of the entire arrangement as a given, a background condition rather than a contested interpretation. Eurystheus knew who was actually directing the sequence of tasks. He was the mechanism through which the tasks arrived, but the tasks themselves came from somewhere older and more capacious than the courtyard of Terrans, from a goddess whose attention to Heracles had begun before his birth and showed no sign of exhausting itself across the decades of his adult life. The labors were the formal, sustained expression of that attention. 12 years organized into tasks designed to be fatal, assigned through a king who was afraid before any of them began, delivered by a herald whose name means dung to a hero who completed them. There is something that the tradition holds in this arrangement that deserves to be stated without dramatic inflection. The labors made Heracles what he became, not in spite of their difficulty, not as a side effect of surviving them. The making was in the doing, each task completed, each return through the gate at Tiryns, each delivery of proof to a king who would not look at it directly. These were the accumulated substance of a hero whose name would persist across centuries and across the entire Mediterranean world, from the places in Iberia where the tradition placed his pillars at the western edge of the sea, to the Black Sea coasts where the labors had carried him northward, to Egypt where the Greeks brought their myths and found them folding into a culture that had been telling its own stories for 3,000 years before the Greeks arrived. The labors were the reason the name carried the weight it carried. Eurystheus had not intended this. The goddess who set him to the task had not intended it either, or not in the way that the outcome resolved. An attempt to destroy through difficulty had produced through each successive completion something that could not be destroyed by difficulty, a reputation built precisely from the fact that the difficulty had been met and the tasks had been done. The Pythos in the ground at Tiryns is the other face of this, a man so afraid of what the labors were making that he could not remain above ground to receive the results. The jar is a measure of Heracles' growing enormity in the mythological imagination, and it measures it in an unusual direction, not by showing the hero directly, but by showing what a powerful man did to avoid being in the same space as him. The gate of Tiryns opened and closed. Copreus walked his circuit. The limestone walls held their position in the plain. Somewhere below ground level, in the bronze dark of a vessel meant for grain, the king waited for the sounds of the courtyard above to settle back into ordinary silence. And somewhere beyond the gate, across the wide Peloponnesian plain, and then past it, in whichever direction the next labor pointed, Heracles was moving through a world that kept expanding outward the further into it the tasks required him to go. Thrace was beyond what the Argolide could see. Crete was across water. The far western ocean required a journey past the end of the Mediterranean, through the strait the tradition remembered as Heracles' own work, the pillars he had set at the edge of the sea to mark the place where the world that sailors knew gave way to something else. The Persian historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, visited the temple at Tyre in Phoenicia that the locals dedicated to a figure they called Melkart, and that the Greeks readily identified with their own Heracles, noting the antiquity of the temple, which its priests said was older than the city of Tyre itself. The identification between the Greek hero and the Phoenician god had been made comfortably across multiple cultures, and Herodotus treated this not as a surprise, but as confirmation of something the Greeks already suspected, that the figure they called Heracles was not only their own. The labors had taken him to the edge of what the Greeks called the world, and past that edge were other traditions, other temples, other names for the same principle of heroic and civilizing force, moving through a world that kept resisting it and being overcome. This is the geography of the labors held at a distance, not the specific monsters or specific places, but the quality of the movement, the outward reach of it, the way the cycle of 12 tasks drew a hero from the courtyard of a king in the Argolide out to the edges of the known earth and back, again and again with the gate of Tiryns as the fixed point that everything orbited. The gate opened when Heracles left, and opened again when Heracles returned, and in between there was everything the tradition remembers as the labors, the wide and impossible circuit of a hero serving a sentence, making himself by completing what he had been given to complete, building from assigned punishment, a name that would outlast the walls of Tiryns by many thousands of years. The walls, as noted, are still there. Copreus has not been remembered with particular fondness. His name survives in the sources because the sources needed to name the mechanism by which commands were transmitted, and the name they preserved carried its own commentary, the Greek word for what it means, the character that Homer briefly sketched in the Iliad, and then moved past, the small dignity of a small role performed without distinction at the court of a king who spent his years in a buried jar. Copreus walked the circuit between the king and the hero, and carried the words that passed between them in one direction only, because the hero never sent words back through him. Heracles received the instructions and then left, moving out through the gate toward the next impossible thing, and Copreus returned inside, where the Pythos waited. Between the enormous walls built by something very large, inside the palace complex they enclosed, there is the image the tradition leaves for Eurystheus, the rim of the jar at ground level, the darkness inside it, the sound of the hero's footsteps diminishing as the gate closes. He had been given authority over a man who would become the most famous hero in the ancient Greek world, and he had exercised that authority by assigning tasks designed to kill, from behind walls too large to be explained by ordinary human effort, through a herald whose name was a joke, while hiding in a jar. The tradition does not editorialize on this. It does not need to. The arrangement is its own commentary, quietly sufficient, held at a register of mild, sustained, genuinely affectionate amusement, the comedy of vast disproportion, of power being very small, of a king underground, while a hero stands in the open air above him. The world outside the gate was still wide. The labors were still being completed. Heracles was somewhere out there in the geography of the tradition, on a plain in Thrace, on the shore of an island the sources only roughly locate, at the far western edge of the sea, where the sun goes down, and the world the Greeks knew gives way to the world they only imagined. He was moving outward through each assigned task, growing with each completion into something the jar at Tiryns could not contain, even if it had wanted to. Copreus walked back through the gate after delivering his latest instruction, the limestone closing behind him, the passage through the wall swallowing the sound of the world outside. The courtyard received him. The Pythos was there in the ground where it had always been, its rim at ground level, its bronze interior waiting with the particular patience of a container designed for long storage. The king was inside it, or would be shortly, settling into the dark and the quiet, while above him the courtyard held the ordinary afternoon light of the argolid, the pale limestone, the dry ground, the shadow of the walls moving slowly as the sun moved. The sounds from outside the gate had already receded. The footsteps that had been audible a moment ago were now somewhere on the road, heading outward, away from Tiryns, toward the next assignment. The jar was dark, the walls were large, the gate was closed. Power, for the moment, was very small and very quiet, waiting below ground level for the sounds of something enormous to pass. In the 5th century before the Common Era, the Temple of Zeus at Olympia stood at the center of the most sacred athletic site in the Greek world, and along its inner porches, carved into the marble metopapes positioned above the columns of the east and west ends, 12 stone panels told a story in compressed, balanced silence. Each panel was roughly the same size. Each was given the same rectangular frame. Each contained one labor, one encounter, one creature, one moment of effort or arrival or completion, and the effect of walking beneath them, looking up from panel to panel, was not of a narrative building towards something, but of a complete cycle held all at once, simultaneously, the way a circle holds all its points at the same moment. The sculptors of those panels were working in the style scholars now call early classical, the figures still and controlled, the muscles not yet straining in the later Hellenistic manner, the calm of the composition matching the calm of the architectural context. Some of those panels are now in the museum at Olympia, others are in the Louvre in Paris, and the building that framed them, one of the largest temples in the ancient Greek world, collapsed in earthquake and flood over centuries and lies now in its fallen courses of stone on the Peloponnesian plain, the columns horizontal where they once stood vertical. But the 12 panels were counted before the building fell, and the number was already long established in the tradition by the time the first stone was cut. The canonical number 12 did not arrive all at once. It emerged gradually as the traditions of different regions, Thebes, Terrans, Argos, Corinth, Athens, contributed their local stories of what Heracles had done, and as those stories were assembled, compared, argued over, and eventually attributed to a single formal structure. The two fullest surviving accounts are those of Apollodorus, writing in his Bibliotheca, and Diodorus Siculus, writing in his own Bibliotheca Historica. And when they are placed side by side, they do not quite agree on the order of events. The sequence of several labors differs between them, and the differences reflect the fact that competing regional traditions were never fully resolved into a single canonical arrangement. Apollodorus presents the labors in a more systematically organized form and is generally treated by scholars as the more reliable structural reference. Diodorus provides additional context, additional detail, a somewhat different internal logic. Neither is presenting something that existed in a single fixed written form before their time. Both are drawing on a tradition that had been oral, dramatic, visual, and regional for centuries before it settled into the prose accounts that survived. What both accounts agree on is the reason the number became 12 rather than 10. Eurystheus, seated in his palace at Turin's, had initially assigned 10 labors. Heracles completed them all, and then Eurystheus reviewed his count and found grounds to disqualify 2. The Lernaean Hydra, the creature with the regenerating heads, the monster that grew 2 necks for every one severed, had been defeated with the assistance of Iolaus, nephew of Heracles, who had held a burning torch and pressed the flame against each freshly cut stump so that the tissue could not regenerate. Eurystheus argued that the presence of another person disqualified the labor from the official count. The Augean stables, the cattle enclosures of King Augeas in Elis, which had not been cleaned in decades, and which Heracles cleared in a single day by diverting the courses of 2 rivers through them, were disqualified on different grounds. Heracles had either accepted payment for the work or had relied on the power of the rivers rather than personal strength alone, and Eurystheus found this reason enough to set it aside. 2 labors removed, 2 additional labors assigned. Apollodorus records this explicitly in the Bibliotheca, presenting it without commentary, as a simple accounting fact about how the number of canonical labors reached the number it reached. The 2 additional labors assigned to fill the places of the disqualified ones were among the most geographically and cosmologically remote in the entire cycle, the fetching of the golden apples from the garden of the Hesperides at the western edge of the world, and the retrieval of Cerberus from the underworld. Both required Heracles to travel beyond the boundaries of the known world, or beneath it entirely, and both required encounters with figures and places that existed outside ordinary mortal geography. The Hesperides were nymphs, daughters, in some versions, of Atlas, who tended a garden no mortal could reach by ordinary roads. Cerberus was the 3-headed dog who guarded the entrance to the realm of the dead, and retrieving him meant descending into the underworld, negotiating passage with its rulers, and returning upward through a threshold that almost nothing mortal had ever crossed in both directions. That these two labors were the additions, the corrections to an accounting dispute, gives them a quality that stands slightly apart from the rest of the cycle, not its most climactic moments by placement, but perhaps its furthest reach, assigned almost as an afterthought to a man who had already completed 10, Iolaus, the nephew whose torch had caused the Hydra labor to be removed from the count, was the son of Iphiclus, Heracles' twin brother, the mortal twin, the one who had screamed in the cradle when the serpents arrived. Iolaus served as charioteer and companion on a number of the labors, and is one of the few figures who appears repeatedly across the cycle rather than in a single episode. His role was practical rather than heroic in the formal sense, driving the chariot, providing assistance, holding the torch, and his presence represents a particular kind of support that the mythological tradition found worth preserving alongside the official narrative of individual feat. The gymnasium in Thebes that bore his name, the Ioleon, functioned for generations as a center of athletic and religious activity connected to the cult of Heracles. Athletes trained there. Rituals connected to both men were performed there. The name of the nephew was spoken in the ordinary course of daily life at a place associated with his uncle's story, and the building stood long after both men had passed out of mortal life, which is the kind of continuation that mythological traditions make possible. The name kept alive in a specific physical space that people continued to use. The geography of the labors, traced from beginning to end, describes a movement outward. The earliest assignments in the cycle are concentrated in a small region of the northeastern Peloponnese, the Nemean Valley, the marshes of Lerna, the hills of Arcadia, the stables of Augeas in Elis, the waters near Stymphalus. These are places a man could walk to. They are places with names on the older maps of the Greek world, places that existed in the actual landscape, and that communities in those areas claimed as sites connected to the stories. The labor set in Nemea was visible every 4 years at the Nemean Games, one of the 4 great Panhellenic athletic festivals, the games said to have been founded in connection with the hero's story. The marshes at Lerna were real marshes, still identifiable in the landscape of the Argolid, and ancient travelers moving through that country would have crossed them, knowing what the tradition said had happened there. From that concentrated beginning, the labors spread. The Cretan bull required a sea crossing. The mares of Diomedes, the man-eating horses of the Thracian king Diomedes, required travel northeast into Thrace, beyond the northern edges of the Greek mainland, into a region that ancient Greek geography associated with wildness and foreignness. The girdle of Hippolyta brought Heracles to the south coast of the Black Sea, to the territory of the Amazons, a people the Greek tradition placed at the edge of the familiar world. The cattle of Geryon required crossing to the far western edge of the Mediterranean, to the island of Erythea, a name that contains in it the same root as the Greek word for red, the red land, the western land, the land where the sun goes when it descends. At the far boundary of that westward journey, the tradition holds that Heracles set up 2 great pillars at the narrowing of the sea, what later geography would call the Strait of Gibraltar, marking the limit of his passage, and by extension, the limit of the navigable world. The Pillars of Heracles, a real geographical feature named for a mythological deed, the naming itself a record of how far the tradition imagined its hero had gone. Beyond Erythea, in the westward sequence, lay the Garden of the Hesperides, which the tradition placed not on any charted coast, but somewhere at the very edge of the world, or perhaps beyond the world, in a geography that blurred into the mythological. The golden apples growing there were gifts from the goddess Gaia to Hera, on the occasion of her marriage to Zeus. They were tended by the daughters of the western sky. Getting to them required either killing or somehow circumventing the serpent Ladon, who coiled in permanent vigilance around the tree. In one of the most memorable episodes in the entire mythological tradition, Heracles did not enter the garden himself. He sent instead Atlas, the Titan condemned to hold the sky on his shoulders at the western rim of the world, into the garden to retrieve the apples, while Heracles himself temporarily took the weight of the sky onto his own shoulders in Atlas's place. What that exchange felt like, the sky pressing down, the specific physical weight of an impossible burden held for the duration of another errand, the tradition does not fully describe. It preserves the exchange itself, the practicality of the solution, and the particular detail that Atlas, once free of his burden, was briefly reluctant to take it back. The descent into the underworld to retrieve Cerberus is recorded by Apollodorus in the Bibliotheca with a specificity that gives the underworld of the tradition its geography. Heracles passed through an entrance at Taenarum, the southernmost point of the Peloponnese, a real cape at the tip of the Mani Peninsula, where a cave opening was understood in the ancient tradition to lead downward. He traveled through the realm of the dead, encountering shades of those who had died, Medusa, whose image he drew his sword on before recognizing she was no longer the living creature who had once threatened, and Meleager, whose shade he spoke with at length in a conversation. Apollodorus summarizes, but Sophocles and others dramatized more fully. He met with Persephone and Hades, the rulers of the dead, and asked for permission to take Cerberus temporarily to the surface. Hades agreed on the condition that Heracles subdue the animal, using no weapons, only his own hands and body. Heracles complied. He wrestled the three-headed dog into submission, carried him up through the entrance at Taenarum, presented him to Eurystheus, who reacted with his characteristic response to the arrival of something impossible, retreating into the bronze Pythos buried in the courtyard at Tiryns, and then returned Cerberus to the underworld. The dog went back. The labor was complete, and the underworld, which had been entered and exited, closed again behind the last living visitor it would receive for a very long time. The Greek tradition had a name for the formal labors and a separate name for the deeds that gathered around the edges of them. The athloi were the canonical assignments, the 12 tasks ordered by Eurystheus, the ones counted by the king, the ones carved into the metopes at Olympia. The parerga were everything else, the supplementary deeds, the episodes that occurred during travel between official assignments, the people helped and the monsters killed, and the wrongs corrected in the course of moving from one labor to the next. Ancient writers, including Apollodorus and Diodorus Siculus, both employ this distinction, which gives the mythology a sense of two simultaneous journeys: the formal, counted, officially recognized cycle running alongside a looser, less structured accumulation of deeds that were also part of the story, but could not technically be entered into the official account. The parerga include encounters with figures who would become significant elsewhere in the mythological tradition, with Pholus the centaur, who received Heracles as a guest and opened a jar of wine, whose smell drew the other centaurs into a violent confrontation that Heracles survived, with Busiris, the Egyptian king who sacrificed strangers and who met a different end when Heracles arrived, with the giant Antaeus, son of Poseidon and Gaia, who drew his strength from contact with the earth, and whom Heracles defeated by lifting him off the ground and holding him there. None of these were official labors. All of them belong to the story. The distinction between athloi and parerga has an interesting structural consequence. It means the tradition distinguishes between what was assigned and what was chosen, between the formal work of penance and the incidental work of a man who encountered something requiring a response and responded. The 12 labors have a beginning point, the oracle at Delphi, the instruction to go to Tiryns, and an ending point, and at the far end of them, the tradition places the promise the oracle had also conveyed that the completion of the 12 years of service would bring immortality. The parerga have no formal beginning or end. They accumulate around the edges of the official structure, attached to it by circumstance rather than assignment. And they give the cycle something the strict 12 cannot provide on their own, a sense of the world that existed between the destinations, the texture of a long road, the things encountered when no official task was yet waiting. The Metopes at Olympia do not include the parerga. They hold the 12 official labors and nothing else, each one given its own stone, its own frame, its own internal balance. What survives of them now is partial, some panels relatively intact, others damaged, others represented only in fragments or in the casts and drawings made by scholars in the centuries since the temple fell. The labor panels that are most completely preserved include the one showing the Symphalian birds, in which Athena is seated receiving the birds Hercules presents to her, and the one showing Atlas returning with the apples, while Athena holds the sky for Hercules. These are scenes of assistance, scenes in which other figures are present, which has its own interest, given that it was assistance that caused 2 labors to be disqualified from the count. The sculptors at Olympia were not making an argument about this. They were representing the tradition as it was known, but the images hold within them the full complexity of the story they illustrate. The man who performed 12 feats, some of them with help, assigned by a king who disqualified the ones that involved assistance, carved in stone at the most important sanctuary in the Greek world, framed in marble panels that have lasted more than 2,000 years. Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century before the Common Era and drawing on earlier Sicilian and Greek sources, gives the labors a slightly different organization from Apollodorus and provides more contextual material around the individual episodes, the social conditions of the regions, the local tyrants and their habits, the people Heracles encountered along the way, who were themselves significant local figures. Reading Diodorus alongside Apollodorus, the labors begin to look less like a single unified cycle and more like an accumulation of separate regional stories that were gradually drawn together under a single structure. This is probably what they were. The stories of Heracles were told across the entire Greek world, in colonies from the Black Sea to Sicily, in mainland cities, in islands, in communities that had nothing else in common but a shared set of stories about the same figure. Each community contributed what it held. The tradition absorbed the contributions. The 12 labors, as they survive in Apollodorus and Diodorus and in the visual record at Olympia, represent the most organized attempt the tradition made to hold those contributions in a single counted, shapeable form. There is a quality to the 12 as a number. In the ancient Mediterranean world, it appears in enough structural contexts that its presence in the labor cycle feels less like coincidence and more like the tradition, choosing a number that carried a sense of completion, of measure, of something that had been properly fulfilled. 12 months in the year, 12 Olympian gods, 12 is the number of panels that could be distributed symmetrically above the inner porches of a major temple, whether the number shaped the tradition or the tradition shaped the count, whether stories were added or removed to reach 12, or whether 12 stories happened to exist and 12 happened to be the number they were given, is not something the surviving sources resolve. What they resolve is the number itself. 12, no more, no fewer, counted by Eurystheus in his courtyard at Tiryns, carved in stone at Olympia, repeated across every surviving account until the number became as much a part of the story as the labors themselves. The outward reach of the cycle, beginning in the Peloponnese, extending to Crete and Thrace, and the Black Sea, and the far west, and the underworld, and the garden at the edge of the world, traces a geography of the archaic Greek imagination at its fullest extension. These were not places at the limits of what was known in a purely cartographic sense. They were places at the limits of what was possible, or what was ordinary, or what mortal life could contain. Erythea, the red island in the far west, was not on any Mycenaean trading route. The garden of the Hesperides was not an olive grove in Arcadia. The underworld was not a cave in the Mani Peninsula, even if the tradition located its entrance at Tyanarum. These were the places the tradition placed at the boundaries, because boundaries require names and locations, because a story about the complete extent of a hero's reach needs coordinates, and because the coordinates available were the ones that already existed in the mythological geography of the Greek world. When Heracles reached them, when he stood at the pillars, or descended at Taenarum, or held the sky in the place where Atlas usually stood, he was not simply traveling, he was completing a map. What the tradition holds at the far end of the 12 labors is a transformation. The penance completed, the miasma cleared, the years of service to a smaller man over. The tradition moves Heracles toward his own end, and then beyond it, through the events that led to his death, through the pyre on Mount Oeta, and then upward into Olympus, where Zeus received his son among the gods. Hera, who had manipulated the birth order to deny Heracles the kingship Zeus had intended, who had sent the serpents into the cradle, who had sent Lyssa to destroy everything he had built, who had used the fear of a Terinthian king as an instrument across 12 years of divine persecution. Hera, at the end of the tradition, gave him her daughter Hebe in marriage. Hebe was the goddess of eternal youth. Her name meant youth itself. The marriage between Heracles and Hebe is recorded in both Pindar and in the closing account of Apollodorus, and it sits at the end of the tradition as something that requires a moment of attention to absorb. The goddess who had been his enemy across his entire mortal life gave him in his immortal life the embodiment of perpetual youth. The name Heracles means glory of Hera. It was given at Delphi, a renaming that marked the formal beginning of the penance cycle, the moment when the birth name Alcides, son of Alcaeus, was set aside and the new name was taken. In naming him for Hera, the oracle was not predicting that Hera would relent. It was recognizing in the compressed and indirect manner of oracular speech that the persecution was itself the mechanism of the glory. Without the serpents in the cradle, without the manipulation of the births, without the divine madness, without Eurystheus and his herald in his buried jar, without 12 years of service to a man who was afraid of him, without all of this, the fame would not exist in the form it exists in. The persecution produced the labors produced the cycle produced the metopes at Olympia. The metopes survived the fall of the temple. The name carried through all of it, and the name contains the name of the goddess who arranged the suffering that made the name permanent. The Iolion in Thebes, the gymnasium that bore the nephew's name, was a building that athletes used in the ordinary course of their training, and the name they spoke when they named the place was the name of a man who had once held a torch at the edge of a swamp and pressed it against the stumps of severed heads. That was the specific act that caused his name to be spoken for generations in a building full of athletes who had no direct connection to the story, who simply trained where they had always trained, under a name that the city had kept. the gymnasium stood, the name persisted. The athletes came and went, generation after generation, and the name of Iolaus was the name of the place where they worked, and through that name, distantly and without drama, the story continued to exist in the world. The tradition, in all its versions, had one thing it held consistently across all the variations, all the different orderings, the competing regional claims, the additional stories, the disputed disqualifications, the arguments about which sources were more reliable and which details had been added later. It held that the labors were completed, the 12 were done, the cycle reached its end, the hero passed through the suffering the tradition had placed before him, and at the far edge of it, the tradition placed something else, not the resolution of every grief or the restoration of everything lost, but something the name had been promising all along, in its compressed and ironic way. The glory the goddess had not intended to give was the glory that her persecution had made inevitable. Heracles, the name spoken slowly, held lightly, its syllables carrying the goddess's name and the word for glory, the two things joined in a compound. The goddess had no intention of making true, was already in the name, from the first time the oracle spoke it at Delphi, on the morning after the night when the penance was assigned, and the hero came back out into the open air of the mountain slope, with a direction where before there had been only ruin. The 12 metapopes above the inner porches at Olympia held the cycle in their marble frames for centuries before the temple fell. The stones that remain still hold it, the particular compression of a labor into a single carved moment, the balanced weight of an early classical composition, the figures still and controlled and permanent in the way that stone figures can be permanent when the rest of the world has rearranged itself entirely around them. The temple of Zeus is horizontal now, the columns in long rows on the ground, the building visible as its own archaeology. But the panels that were carried away before the fall still carry the same content they always carried, framed in marble in Paris and in Olympia, the labors distributed as they were distributed, one per panel, 12 panels, the number that the tradition chose and counted and kept. The Iolians stood in Thebes, and athletes trained beneath that name, and the name was spoken in the course of an ordinary day by people walking in and people walking out, and the name of the nephew carried in it, distantly and without ceremony, the name of the uncle, and in the name of the uncle, the name of the goddess, and in the name of the goddess, the long irony that the tradition had been holding since the oracle first spoke at Delphi, that the glory and the persecution were the same thing, moving together through 12 years, and 12 labors, and 12 stone panels, and the long accumulation of stories that gathered around the edges of the official count, all of it still there in the tradition, still carried in the sources, still held in the name that was given to a figure who had already demonstrated, in a Theban nursery before he could walk or speak, the particular quality that the tradition had decided to call by a goddess's name. The Iolian gymnasium stands in the scholarship, the name preserved in ancient texts that describe it, the building gone now from the Theban landscape, as most buildings from that era are gone. The name is still spoken when scholars read those texts. It has been spoken in translation, carried across languages, carried through centuries during which the specific location of the building was unknown and uncertain and disputed. Still, the name was spoken. The athletes who trained there are not remembered.